I would like to welcome you all here to this webinar, which is from the ReMO Cost Action. A Cost Action is a big networking project within Europe in the fields of science, technology, and research. And a cost action generally deals with a specific topic and kind of brings researchers from all parts of Europe to collaborate on particular topics. That we have many kind of meetings, but also and events and a conference coming up at the end of August in Budapest. But we also run webinars, we run training schools, and we have travel grants for meetings, and we also have travel grants for research visits called short-term scientific missions. This webinar today is about understanding the psychology of imposter syndrome in academia and beyond, and what is it and what can be done? This is a topic that is highly relevant to many people within research and beyond research. Dara McCashin is a young psychologist. He's a young professor at the Dublin City University, and he is the chair of our working group 3, which is focused on practitioners and bottom-up initiatives. So topics like mentoring, mental health first aid, and kind of practical interventions. So with that, I will give the floor to Dara, and Dara will introduce his topic, and we will hear his presentation, and afterwards you will have opportunity to ask questions.
Thanks, Brian. And good afternoon to all of you. It's really, I think one thing I've noticed when the topic went live on social media is that it hits a nerve when we talk about imposter syndrome. Everyone, and I've got messages from old colleagues and friends who saw it on LinkedIn. They said, "Oh, it's great that you're doing this. There's something particularly interesting that we all know, we all nod and understand this thing that we call imposter syndrome." But I'm particularly interested, coming from a psychology background and thinking about what the evidence says, things that we can do maybe at an individual level, at an institutional level, and indeed at a more kind of policy level, which are in fact the 3 working groups of our cost action called ReMO. So as Brian said, there'll be plenty of links throughout the chat, just to kind of keep you up to date on the various projects and activities that are within our action. As Brian said, so I'm in the School of Psychology as assistant professor at Dublin City University. And I primarily work in the area of kind of the intersection of human psychology with technology. So a lot of my work has looked at the kind of the specific effects of it in different clinical settings, but also criminal settings. And I largely fell into the research world of researcher mental health from just, I suppose, initially speaking up about it in different funding circles, and I haven't been let go since, basically. Before we talk, this presentation, this webinar is mainly informational and academic. So, of course, it's not professional medical or mental health care interventions. So just to be aware of that. So how do we begin? I suppose I want to talk about the experiences. I would like to hear your experiences. Because of the numbers we have, it'd probably be best if we stick to chat for now, and then during the Q&A it would be great to hear some voices. I'll talk a little bit about the context, how we might define this thing that is known as imposter syndrome, and also the evidence as well. And then, more importantly, what can we do, I suppose, to address it. But let's start with a quote. Who doesn't love a quote? No matter what we've done, there comes a point where you think, how did I get here? When are they going to discover that I am, in fact, a fraud and take everything from me? So that is from, anyone want to have a guess who that's from in the chat? I wish we had spot prizes for the answer, but this is in fact, oops, gone to the wrong slide, Tom Hanks. No doubt if you Google imposter syndrome, you'll certainly see various celebrities and entities and business people and academics all talk about their own version of it. What about this one? When I was younger, I just did it. I just acted. It was just there. So now when I receive recognition for my acting, I feel incredibly uncomfortable. I tend to turn in on myself. I feel like an imposter. It was just something I did. This is from Emma Watson. So a slightly different manifestation of a similar feeling of imposterism, if you like. How am I supposed to seem competent when I'm talking to hundreds of people? What if they see through me and realize I'm a fake? And that quote is actually from myself, because as I was preparing these slides, I was coming to realize actually there is a very healthy interest and sizable interest in this topic. So I want to do it justice. So I was getting those ironic feelings of imposter myself. But look, we all resonate with this thing that has come to be known as imposter syndrome. There's many memes, there's many serious stories about how debilitating these feelings can be, and they go something like this: like, no matter what happens, no matter where I am or what I'm doing or what I would like to do, I have this internal narrative that says things that, look, it was just luck that I got here. I just worked harder than others because I'm not as good as others. Essentially, I really am a fraud, and I will at some point be found out. And depending on the environment, they can take different forms. What's unique about academia, we'll come on to in a second, it can perpetuate that type of cognition in slightly different ways. And I'm also conscious that we may even have people who have left academia, or who are perhaps in a more industry-facing or NGO type role. So I want to try and keep it broad as well. But the principles are indeed the same, or similar. This is skip the slide. This is a technique used by educational psychologist Dr. Hugh Kearns, where if you flip the cognition of imposter syndrome, and if you say, well, actually, within our 128 participants, we do have more than one imposter who actually has got lucky and has been a fraud, and their work is not up to scratch, and they will be found out. When you flip it like that and you start to feel, oh gosh, what if that's me? You tend to see the levels of imposter feelings that can be out there. The overall context is, as I'm sure you're all aware, quite broad. As of today, there's just under 20 million results for imposter syndrome on Google. There's a massive industry, namely kind of self-help type stuff that emphasizes to you about how you can address your imposter syndrome. Courses, books, seminars, different levels of unregulated coaching, for example, are everywhere. And of course, variable quality because of the difficulties with regulation. There's an interesting, although certainly limited, evidence base as well, which we'll speak a little bit about. These are just some of the dynamics that define academia. Uncertainty is certainly one of those words. This is a graph. The accuracy is perhaps being updated. This is from Royal Society Report 2010. If you look at the various pathways that we all journey throughout academia, many of us might have expectations about where we're going with our masters, with our undergraduate, with our PhD, with our diploma, and very often we end up somewhere else, either happily or unhappily, and our identity is often very much bound up with that. And increasingly within our ReMO cost action, we're talking about, well, do we sufficiently tell younger colleagues about these different pathways and prepare them for different types of outcomes? We're also living in a state of flux with respect to the future of work. Hypermobility is a word that's applicable particularly to the academic environment, where we go where the funding is, we go where the particular supervisor might be, or what the EU often tells us to do with respect to certain grants. We have to be mobile, and with that comes more uncertainty. We're also living in an industry within various industries where there is a great resignation, and the shift onto the employees driving what they want has also been seen, largely due to the effect of the pandemic and realizing actually virtual and hybrid formats can work. So that's another interesting ingredient here. When we think about a definition, here's one that I like. So the term imposter phenomenon was actually the correct, or I think the correct phrase, which originated in the kind of clinical psychotherapy literature in and around the 1970s. So despite facts and trends to support otherwise, individuals feel intense feelings of self-doubt, fear of being exposed, and a sense that they know somehow they tricked their way into a field with peers unknowingly overrating their competencies. So that's Patricia Clance and Ime in 1978. I think she's an Atlanta-based psychotherapist. And in terms of how do these feelings, or how does this phenomenon come about? Like, what's actually caused it? Now, I'm very conscious that I'm coming from a psychology background, so I won't give you slide after slide to do with each of these areas, but perhaps some of you are interested in it. We know, for example, there's a lot of overlap conceptually and evidence-wise with some of these, so personality traits, for example. People that have experienced high levels of neuroticism, which might be termed kind of negative emotion. There's a significant overlap there with the occurrence of, or the feelings of, being an imposter. And it's interesting, you can also offset that with other personality traits. So what you might see in academia is you very highly conscientious people who can offset and try and manage their negative emotion by being conscientious with certain tasks. And that can be a helpful thing, but it can also be an avoidant thing as well, if the imposter feelings are too intense. Childhood, even like that earlier quote from Emma Watson, something about how we experience reward and identity as a child, where that manifests can actually then predict how we might feel a sense of being an imposter later in life. Because let's face it, at each step of a hierarchy, in a workplace, in a sports domain, in a relationship domain, in an interpersonal domain, we will always be we will be new to a certain area. So it makes sense to feel like you're a fish out of water. And that's a natural and normal adaptation. It's when it's a crippling sense of, I am a fraud and should not be here and will be found out. These are the things that differentiate different types of feelings. Trauma as well. And of course, wider ecosystem variables are of course at play here. So societies that have different levels of discrimination, different kind of cultural, sociocultural practices can also play a role here. The gender dimensions is something that's increasingly being recognized in the literature as manifesting imposter phenomenon in a different way. And indeed, actually, the original article in 1978, the sample was, I think, high achieving female professionals. Okay. This is a really nice cycle in terms of thinking about the experience, what it's actually like to go through the imposter cycle. This is, again, Dr. Hugh Kearns, and this is a cycle based largely on that psychotherapeutic literature. For any budding sociologists in our audience, you'll notice there the link to Irving Goffman's book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. I originally was a sociology undergraduate before I had my own identity crisis, realized psychology was my home. But there's a beautiful framework within sociology, the kind of symbolic interactionism of that era, which says actually the world is a stage in many ways, and we're all simply playing a role. We do this every day. There's certain behaviors that dictate how we queue for the tram or the bus. There's certain behaviors and etiquette that we engage in when we attend a webinar. It's a useful way to think about the broad context through which feelings of imposterism manifest. But it starts off something like this. You might feel like a fraud for whatever reason. Things are not okay, things aren't good enough. You'll go about looking for a reason. And then what comes from that is a target. So you might think, I'm not good enough. I'm going to go get a master's. And then if I have my master's, then I'll be okay. And then you'll work to achieve that. And you'll probably will achieve it. And you get a momentary pleasure from that. Then the glow and the celebration quickly wears off, and then it starts again. And no matter what happens along the way, whether it's your partner, your supervisor, your friends, social media, the world telling you that you've done a good job here, you will still find a way of overriding that and say, no, no, no. And then you'll move on to the next thing. And this is this insidious cycle. And people are very, very good at finding excuses and finding reasons why they're not good enough. It's amazing. It's amazing to see. You have the most intelligent, high-achieving people that you work with, for example, and they'll find the most non-evidence-based answer as to why they are a fraud. And the effects of this are perhaps unsurprising. So there's literature there to link this, not necessarily cause, but certainly heavily linked to low mood, reduced self-esteem, anxiety, social dysfunction. Self-esteem is an interesting one because conceptually it is a different psychological construct. It's heavily overlapped with imposter phenomenon, but they are not the same thing. There is only one systematic review. So ideally in science, if we think of a big pyramid of evidence, the gold standard is often a well-done systematic review, which is a study of studies. To my knowledge, there has only been one completed. This was by Bravata et al. 2020. So here we have just over 60 studies over 14,000 participants. And we have an issue here. So the prevalence, how common is imposter syndrome, as they termed it, between 9 and 82% of all those studies. That was the range of prevalence. Most of these were student samples. But just over 10 were graduates, were kind of postgraduate samples. Those experiencing imposter phenomenon had fears that were significantly connected to maintaining their social standing and not wishing to showcase imperfection to peers. And then the flip side of that, social support and self-worth were highly negatively associated with imposter characteristics. And much like that kind of theoretical background, imposter phenomenon was also significantly related to pessimism, perfectionism, and low self-esteem. So clearly high levels of kind of self-report and the clinically observed traits of imposter phenomenon across all of these studies, most of which were in academia, because in academia we love to study each other. But I think we can probably nod and understand some of these traits. We probably all know the pessimistic, perfectionist person that is perhaps engaging in those behaviors to mask self-esteem issues, and this manifests in academia in very particular ways. And I've had many a conversation about that with people. But there are certainly problems with this. The chart here on the left is like, the scientific hierarchy of what constitutes actionable evidence to bring about change individually, institutionally, and at policy levels. And we still haven't got a lot of conceptual clarity in this whole area. It's so hard to measure, for example, the socio-cultural or the cross-cultural variables that we know absolutely play a role here. I mentioned earlier about hypermobility. So if you are, for example, a young person coming from the Far East into a rural part of Europe to do a postdoc, it's very hard to measure the specific cross-cultural differences that directly cause or influence feelings of being an imposter, yet we know they must play some sort of role. Institutional level factors. So a lot of the work that we engage in this cost action pertains to responsible research environments, sustainable careers, valuing and understanding the mental health and the well-being of students right through to their later careers. And with that, understanding the ethics of it, the leadership and supervisory styles, and the wider socioeconomic landscape. All of these factors, of course, play a role in our mental health, and by extension, feelings of being an imposter or not. but they have not been embedded in the literature. It's been just a focus on the individual, which is interesting from a psychological standpoint, but notwithstanding all of that, there hasn't really, to my knowledge, been a high quality, by which I mean at the top of this evidence pyramid, a high quality intervention study that's looked at all of these variables over time, pre, post, and more medium to long term across all the various industries. So we still have a poor link between theory and practice. And this is despite the many sales pitches that we see with people trying to sell you the solution to your imposter syndrome. So we really need to be careful with language given this evidence overview, which is why I'm trying to maintain the language of imposter phenomenon rather than syndrome. And it was originally like the original psychologists that coined the term imposter phenomenon. No one's specifically sure where in the literature it turned into syndrome. But despite that, it's, I would argue, facilitating a kind of a medicalized and unnecessarily pathological interpretation of what might be appropriate individual responses to complex situations. And as someone said to me earlier when I was discussing this slide, they're like, sometimes the world is shit and your reaction is a very normal reaction to that. And that reflects the broader debate in psychology. Is there mental illness, or are actually we simply experiencing a normal response to a very challenging world? So it's important that we remain really critical of that. And indeed, we are seeing with the various awareness campaigns, cost actions like ourselves, ReMO, and the many bottom-up initiatives that we see, particularly on social media, the hashtag academic mental health, the various campaigns that are nicely gaining rhythm are calling out these things and realizing actually, whilst I feel like an imposter and there's an important psychological set of ingredients at play there, the system is broken in various ways. And we need to have a multi-level response to that. And again, this is mirroring how we organize the 3 working groups within ReMO to have individual, institutional, and policy responses. It's a very academic answer to what might be seen as a psychological problem, but however. I wanted to keep it to 30 minutes because you don't want me talking at you for too long, but a synthesis in one slide of what I would classify as some of the top tips. The first one, I know it sounds obvious, but it is that awareness building. We were at a conference in Portugal in March, and just being able to say to other people, postdoc, PhD, undergraduate, master's student, senior professor, everyone being able to say, no, pretty much 4 or 5 times a week, I feel like an outright imposter. I feel like everyone knows that I'm an imposter and they're not telling me. These are powerful things to hear. And it's very easy to initiate that conversation if you are aware of how this thing manifests. I was speaking with someone earlier who does have peer-to-peer support, and they all share when they have their tea once a week, twice a week, they all share how they're feeling with respect to that. That's one way to externalize and stay separate to it. It's also where the role of mentoring, effective mentoring, can come in, where you can recognize these things so as not to internalize them further. And the various communication strategies that we use to do that are all part of the solution. Which is why I think the branding surrounding the self-help industry with imposter phenomenon is so unique, because there's so many different ways to address it. So trying to build that interaction, whether it's through those mechanisms or indeed through our own networks, would be a really important way to start. I would just think of a student who's beginning their academic career, for example, to find a way of setting rules set us free. So set up a once a week coffee and chat session. You're not allowed to talk about work. You're just talking about how you feel and how this imposter feeling is either high or low. That would be one place to start. The whole fake it till you make it dynamic can be leveraged positively or negatively. You know, if we're saying the world is a stage and we're aware that the feelings of imposterism are at play, you can also try and override that by recognizing it, keeping it separate to you, and then going on regardless. I talked about the issue with feeling it's your fault or that you have some syndrome. So I would say maintain a healthy skepticism and critique of this "you need to fix it" approach. Perhaps the more evidence-based psychological interventions are the way to go. CBT and ACT, chief among them. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and likewise acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, are both very helpful ways to begin to address particularly maybe a more clinically significant levels of imposter phenomenon, by which I mean if this talk is resonating with you and you really are unable to continue your study or your research because of these feelings, or they are actively ruining your day to the extent that you can't do certain behaviors such as complete your essay, that's when the role of therapy can play an important role. I won't go through the principles of these therapy, but they start with recognizing the thinking, the underpinning feelings for you specifically, how that relates to your behavior. So are you looking at your citation index every day, or are you trying to work on something that you have implicit value attached to? And the acceptance of that cycle and understanding your values, and then rebuilding your own cycle to allow you to avoid the perhaps unnecessary feelings of imposter syndrome that will always probably be there. People are always interested in how they might go about measuring their feelings of being an imposter relative to others. A word of caution on this: it's very tempting to go off and do these scales and then compare them with our colleagues. But it is an evidence base, and it's worth consulting if you are interested in it. So the original scale from that 1978 psychotherapy article is linked here, and we'll share these slides. And likewise, there's a review of all the different measures that you may wish to consult if you're looking to take a more systematic approach to it. So I'm going to stop there. I've tried to give you a broad overview of the literature as I understand it, and a very succinct kind of summary of some of the top tips. But like any meeting, I think it's useful if we have a Q&A, perhaps facilitated by Brian, and then we go from there. To kick it off, as we just see who's raised hands, if anyone wants to give maybe a one-sentence reflection on what the presentation did for you, that would be really interesting, because this can always land in different ways depending where we are in our career stage. And I'm conscious we have participants from different countries, different cultures, different time zones, different disciplines. So we are a nice mix. So it'd be great to hear any reflections that you have.